Capcom, another one of the companies that put out a ton of great games during the 90s. Often compared to Konami, these two companies were a real 1-2 punch when it came to providing third-party support to consoles. There's a lot of great games that come to mind when I think of Capcom, but there's always three big franchises that immediately pop into my head: Mega Man, Street Fighter, and Resident Evil. You won't find many retro gamers that don't like at least one of these series, if not all of them. And yeah, I know that Monster Hunter has turned into an enormous series for them, but we're talking about the 90s in this video. Okay, so let's start with Mega Man, and while Mega Man established itself in the 80s with a slew of popular releases for the NES, that would continue into the 90s I might add. When I think of 90s Mega Man, I think of the Mega Man X series. That's not to say Mega Man X is necessarily better, it's just that the original series saw its initial popularity with Mega Man 2 and 3, which were both 80s games, and the NES Mega Man games that followed felt like more of an extension of that vibe, and not a new wave of games for the series like Mega Man X did. As a result, I've always identified the regular Mega Man as the 80s Mega Man. Mega Man X was Capcom taking advantage of the more advanced hardware of the Super Nintendo. Luckily, the game is generally agreed to be pretty awesome, and that's certainly how I feel about it. What really elevates any game company is knowing how to transition a popular game or franchise. In this case, it wasn't a jump from 2D to 3D, but rather just from one 2D console to another more advanced 2D console. Mega Man X keeps all the things that made the original Mega Man games so fun. A bunch of unique bosses with stages to match, of which you get to choose the order you go through them, where the unique weapons you get from each boss will have advantages against other bosses. Besides the weapons you obtain, there's also different power-ups and upgrades you can pick up along the way, making what order you go through the stages give these games a lot of depth and complexity. I think it could be argued that no game series is more well known for letting you choose the order in which you go through the stages, with people often posting their personal lists for what path they take, since it matters so much. Everything that made the series great was well done yet again in Mega Man X, and all with a fresh coat of paint that made the game feel supercharged. Sprites were bigger, backgrounds were more detailed, you could do a bunch of cool new stuff like dash and wall jump. The music was once again well done, bringing that upbeat and energetic flavor that the series is known for. The X series, similar to the mainline series, would see a ton of games released for it throughout the 90s, showing Capcom's commitment to 2D gaming despite the trends of the gaming industry, and much to the delight of many retro gamers nowadays who are fans of 2D gaming. One series that benefited greatly from this decision by Capcom was Street Fighter. Now, of course, Street Fighter 2 needs no introduction, as it was one of the most popular and famous arcade games of all time, coming out in the early 90s. In fact, while this game couldn't save the arcades from their eventual demise, it could be argued that it single-handedly breathed some much-needed life into them, as they experienced a noticeable drop-off in popularity from the 80s. After all, arcades were massively popular in the 80s. Street Fighter 2 was the game in arcades during its peak, with the cabinets sometimes having lines of people waiting for their turn. Rather than making a sequel right away for the game, they would instead update the game a few times, starting a trend Capcom is now infamous for, with people often making fun of the naming conventions they'd use to label each release. Words like Turbo, Hyper, Super, Champion all started to sound a bit comical after we saw Capcom do it enough times. Anyways, after the massive success of Street Fighter 2, Capcom would then go on to make the Street Fighter Alpha series, as well as the Street Fighter Vs series, with the first entry being X-Men vs Street Fighter. And by this point, we were making our way well into the mid-90s, when most companies had abandoned pixel-based games. The Street Fighter Vs series proved to be very popular and well-liked, eventually evolving into the Marvel vs Capcom series. And sure, Marvel vs Capcom 2 came out in arcades a mere couple months after the 90s had ended, but but in a lot of ways that game felt like a bookend to the decade, being perhaps the last great arcade hit of that era in a lot of people's minds. I bring it up because if you start with Street Fighter 2 and end with the Marvel vs. Capcom series, Capcom essentially had an entire decade in which they made popular 2D fighting games. And I haven't even mentioned all the 2D fighting games they made. There was of course Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, which would find much more popularity in later years due to its more technical mechanics that cater well to the competitive scene. There were the lesser known Darkstalkers games, and if you want to get even more obscure than that, there's stuff like the arcade game Red Earth, which wasn't even released in the US. But it wasn't just fighting games that Capcom put out in arcades during the 90s, they also developed a reputation for making some of the best beat-em-up games, and they put out a ton of them. I often like to reference the Capcom beat-em-up bundle, which is a great way to get a huge chunk of these games, but there were also a bunch they made that used licensed properties and therefore are more limited to being re-released due to various legal hurdles that they need to deal with. My dream would be for them to release a beat-em-up bundle volume 2 with every beat-em-up they made that carries a license, but I think it's safe to say that's pretty unlikely. Anyways, Capcom really set the standard for beat-em-ups, and I've always found them to be a nice complement to their fighting game output. And it makes sense, right? Both genres are about getting smacked around. When it comes to 3D games, even Capcom wasn't immune to this trend, and they did put out some 3D games by the end of the 90s. Most famous of all was the Resident Evil series, often credited for popularizing the survival horror genre. The second one you see here is my personal favorite, though I'm a big fan of 3 as well. When gamers first played the original Resident Evil game though, it was such a new spin on video games that even the super cheesy voice acting didn't dissuade gamers from calling the game scary overall. And while the voice acting would get a little better with the sequels, it didn't get better by much, and funny enough, it often gets credited for paying tribute to the cheesy vibe that many classic horror films were known for. I'm a fan of the charm it carries myself. I think Resident Evil is the series from Capcom that shows me I'm just flat out a fan of how they make games. Because here's the thing, I'll be the first person to say that I'm not a fan of how most early 3D games look, and I'll even admit that I think the early Resident Evil games look like crap, and especially compared to the 2D magic they were putting out at the same time. But damn it if I don't love playing these games. The gameplay just has a very arcade-like quality to it, mixed with a little bit of open-endedness and figuring out what to do that games of the time were starting to adopt more and more. Plus, if the visuals of the original Resident Evil are really that much of a deal breaker for you, then there's always the remake of it they did that looks beautiful. I think the main gameplay mechanic of Resident Evil that feels very retro to me is the inventory management. In more modern games, they just load you up with tons of ammunition, but not here, and they even doubled down on that by limiting how much you can save with the ink ribbons, not allowing you to save after every 5 seconds of progress? Yeah, that's very anti-modern gaming and feels retro to me. It makes progress in the game feel all the more valuable, and the penalty for death actually means something, incentivizing you to stay alive at all costs, which is what survival horror should feel like. You know, by that understanding, could we call a bunch of other retro games survival horror as well? Okay, and last but not least, I do want to mention Capcom's relationship with Sega during the 90s. It really changed drastically from the start of the decade to the end. At the beginning, they gave fairly limited support to the Genesis. Sure, they brought Street Fighter 2 and some other ports over, but I've always felt this was a huge missed opportunity to make some original games for the Genesis with its unique hardware in mind, like Konami did. Could have been something really special. They would start to support Sega a lot more, however, with the Sega Saturn receiving a ton of releases, covering a lot of their most popular games, and because the Saturn's hardware catered toward 2D games, it would often receive the best versions of Capcom games, with X-Men vs. Street Fighter being perhaps the most famous example. This support would continue with the Dreamcast, which launched right at the end of the decade and was supported so heavily by Capcom that it almost felt like a joint console from Sega and Capcom. Okay, and so that about does it for Capcom in the 90s. They would eventually lose their way a little bit in later years, but also managed to put out some great games on more modern consoles as well. For this video, I'd be curious to hear what some of your favorite Capcom games from the 90s are. I would imagine quite a few of you will be mentioning some of the Mega Man games. Am I wrong, or do my viewers really love Mega Man? Well, we'll find out in the comments, so be sure to write your response down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games.